It all began on a morning so bright that the sunlight seemed almost cheerful, mocking the unease settling over my backyard. Birds chirped in the trees, their songs slicing through the quiet hum of suburban life, while the gentle breeze swayed the branches, casting playful shadows across the lawn. My shed, tucked neatly in the far corner of the yard, had stood there for years without incident. Its faded wooden walls and slightly crooked roof were familiar and comforting, a private little retreat that had stored my tools, old furniture, and memories. I had never imagined that one day, those same walls would become the battleground for a neighborhood feud that would spiral into chaos. The first sign that something was amiss was a simple notice attached to the front gate, fluttering in the morning wind. The official HOA letterhead was unmistakable, and the words "violation notice" were stamped in red ink that seemed to burn against the crisp white paper. I picked it up cautiously, feeling a sudden jolt of anxiety. The letter claimed that my shed was unauthorized construction and demanded its immediate removal, threatening fines and legal action if I failed to comply. I had always followed the HOA rules meticulously, paying dues on time, attending meetings, and even volunteering for neighborhood events. Yet here it was, a sudden accusation that seemed absurd, a direct attack on a structure that had existed for years. As I stood there, the sunlight falling across the neatly trimmed grass, I began to notice small details that previously had gone unnoticed. There were cameras on the streetlight corners, small black domes glinting in the sun. A neighbor's security system, pointed my way, captured the subtle motions of my yard. Even the white SUV parked across the street, with its mirrored windows, reflected brief glimpses of my property. The awareness of surveillance made my skin prickle. Every moment, every step, every shadow of my shed had been recorded by someone with a vested interest. And now, it seemed, those recordings were being used against me. I circled the shed, sunlight glinting off the rusted hinges of the old lock. Its wooden walls, slightly warped by years of sun and rain, felt stronger today, as if they knew what was coming. I examined the ground around it, noting the faint impressions in the dirt where the foundation had settled over time, the grass slightly flattened from years of careful maintenance. This shed was more than wood and nails. It was history. It was my backyard fortress, and now it was under threat. I could feel the weight of the HOA's scrutiny pressing down, a looming shadow that stretched even in the brightest sunlight. Walking back toward the house, I tried to understand why they would suddenly target my shed. There were other sheds in the neighborhood, some newer, some older, yet my name was on the violation notice. Perhaps it was envy, perhaps it was arbitrary enforcement, or perhaps there was something hidden within that the HOA had somehow discovered. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. For years, I had kept certain items in the shed, things not illegal, not harmful, but private and precious. The idea that anyone might see or judge them filled me with dread. I spent the afternoon documenting everything. My camera captured every angle of the shed, from the peeling paint to the uneven shingles on the roof. Sunlight highlighted imperfections and shadows alike, providing a detailed record in case the HOA tried to claim negligence or hazard. I mapped out the property line, checked zoning regulations, and meticulously reviewed the HOA guidelines. Everything suggested that my shed was compliant. Yet, the notice was real, the threat was real, and the impending confrontation felt inevitable. As the hours passed, I noticed more subtle signs that the HOA had been observing for some time. Faint footprints in the dirt near the shed, slightly disturbed grass along the path, and the distant whir of a drone hovering too high to be casual. Each discovery added tension. Each detail suggested that the HOA's inspection had been covert, almost invasive, and now it was culminating in this violation notice. The backyard, once my sanctuary, had transformed into a stage, and the shed was the central character under scrutiny. By late afternoon, I had constructed a mental timeline of events. The notice had arrived in the morning. Cameras and subtle surveillance had been ongoing for weeks, perhaps months. Someone had observed every detail of my shed, every movement, every small addition or repair, and now the HOA was ready to make its move. The bright daylight illuminated not just the yard, but the tension, the unspoken battle that was quietly unfolding. My mind raced with questions. Were they aware of what was inside the shed? Had someone tipped them off? And if so, what would happen when they discover the truth? The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawn, turning the yard into a patchwork of light and darkness. Even as the day remained bright, the growing shadows reminded me that the confrontation was near. I felt the need to prepare, to secure the shed, to document every inch of it, and to consider what might be exposed if they try to tear it down. It was a strange juxtaposition. The cheerful day outside, birds singing, light reflecting off every surface, and inside me, a storm of worry and anticipation. I spent the evening organizing my tools, making mental notes of every item stored in the shed, and thinking about how I would respond if the HOA came unannounced. My mind wandered to scenarios of confrontation, negotiation, and revelation. Every plan seemed fragile, yet necessary. The shed was no longer just a storage space. It had become the center of a mystery, a secret waiting to be revealed. And in the bright daylight, every detail, every reflection, every glimmer of what was inside seemed to take on a life of its own. As night approached, though the yard remained bathed in residual sunlight, I realized the true tension had only begun. The shed's walls concealed more than tools. They had secrets that the HOA could never understand, secrets that had nothing to do with rules or regulations, but could explain their sudden interest. The thought lingered in my mind, creating a suspenseful anticipation for what the next day would bring. Whatever the HOA expected, I knew that what they were about to uncover would be far more shocking than any violation notice could convey. The first day of this unfolding drama ended quietly, yet the air seemed charged with expectation. The shed, standing firm in the bright daylight, was ready to defend its secrets. And as I looked out over the backyard, I understood that this was only the beginning. Tomorrow, the HOA would arrive, and what was hidden inside the shed would finally meet the light of day. The morning sun spilled over the neighborhood, painting every rooftop and lawn in shades of gold and white. Birds chirped energetically, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing in my backyard. The light made the grass glisten with dew, highlighting the perfectly trimmed edges and the worn path leading to my shed. Everything looked calm, peaceful, and ordinary. Yet beneath this serene daylight, tension rippled through the air, invisible but unmistakable. The HOA was coming today, and every detail of my yard, every shadow cast by the shed, and every object hidden within it was about to be scrutinized. I watched from the kitchen window as the first HOA inspector appeared at the end of the driveway. Dressed in a crisp uniform, clipboard in hand, the inspector moved with a practiced air of authority. Behind them, a second car approached, a white SUV, its windows darkened, reflecting the bright sun, hiding the people inside. The movement of the vehicles was deliberate, slow, and almost theatrical. It was as if the entire neighborhood had paused for this inspection. Even the wind seemed to still itself, making the day feel unusually quiet for the usual suburban hum. Stepping into the yard, the inspector's gaze swept across the lawn with meticulous care, pausing at the flower beds, the edges of the property, and finally, my shed. The sun glinted off the metal roof, casting reflections that flickered like warnings across the grass. I could feel every second as the inspection stretched, each movement deliberate. They walked around the shed, measuring, noting, and occasionally glancing toward the house, as if expecting something to be revealed. The tension in the bright, cheerful day was palpable. It was almost surreal how the sunlight highlighted the unease, throwing every detail into sharp relief. I moved closer, trying to keep a calm posture, but every part of me was alert. The shed, standing quietly in its corner, seemed almost alive under the scrutiny. The sunlight illuminated the cracks in the wood, the faint discoloration from years of rain, and the moss growing along the foundation. These were imperfections I had always considered trivial, mere signs of age and character. Today, they were magnified under the bright light, turning innocuous details into potential ammunition. The inspectors circled the shed methodically, their pens scratching on the clipboard, occasionally glancing toward the darkened SUV, as if consulting unseen allies. Then came the first hint that the HOA might know more than they were letting on. As the inspector crouched near the base of the shed, their eyes lingered on one specific panel of the siding. A faint glint reflected from the sunlight hitting a small metal latch, a latch that hadn't been moved in years. Their gaze sharpened, and I could see the gears turning in their mind, analyzing, hypothesizing, suspecting. I realized then that this wasn't just a routine inspection. Something about the shed had caught their attention, something they weren't expecting, something hidden that I had hoped would remain private. I stepped back, my heart rate quickening as I watched them continue. Every movement of the inspector seemed exaggerated under the bright sun, every gesture deliberate, as if performing for an unseen audience. The shadows cast by the shed and surrounding trees added an odd sense of drama to the scene, stretching long across the lawn and flickering with the slightest breeze. The contrast of bright light and deep shadows made even the smallest details stand out. The worn hinges, the slight gap in the roofline, the subtle indentation where the ground met the wooden frame. Each imperfection was now a point of focus, magnified by daylight and scrutiny. The inspector made notes, occasionally pointing toward the darkened windows of the house, indicating that they were aware of more than what was immediately visible. The SUV remained stationary, a silent sentinel, its tinted windows hiding cameras or observers who could see every movement. I wondered for the first time if someone had tipped them off, if the HOA had known about the shed's contents for weeks or even months. The idea that my privacy had been breached sent a shiver down my spine. Bright daylight that should have been reassuring now felt intrusive, exposing more than just the yard. It seemed to reveal my secrets as well. I circled the shed slowly, pretending to tend to the flower bed while keeping a careful eye on the inspection. The inspector's methods were almost theatrical, measuring, jotting notes, snapping photos from multiple angles, occasionally glancing at the sunlight hitting the shed. Each reflection seemed to illuminate a potential clue, every shadow hinting at something hidden. The sweat forming on my brow felt heavier in the bright sun, a reminder that while the day was beautiful, the tension was suffocating. I could almost feel the shed reacting, as though it knew it was under siege and was bracing for exposure. Suddenly, the inspector's pen paused. Their eyes narrowed at a small gap near the floor of the shed, just above the ground. The sunlight reflected off something inside, faint but unmistakable, a glimmer of metal, the edge of something that hadn't been meant for observation. Their head tilted, a subtle gesture, as if calculating possibilities, drawing conclusions. My heart pounded, knowing that what they had glimpsed was the beginning of a discovery that could change everything. The shed had been a quiet guardian of my private treasures, and now, under the unrelenting clarity of daylight, it was beginning to reveal hints of its secrets. The SUV windows darkened even further as the second inspector stepped out, moving with caution. They didn't speak, but their gaze swept over the yard, the shed, and me. I realized that the inspection wasn't just for rules or compliance. It was for discovery. They were hunting for the hidden, the unusual, the things that had always stayed tucked away behind wooden walls and locked doors. The bright, cheerful day contrasted sharply with the growing sense of unease. The sun illuminated everything, leaving nothing to hide in the shadows, and every reflection hinted at exposure. By late morning, it was clear that the inspection had shifted from routine to deliberate. The HOA's attention wasn't just on the shed's dimensions, compliance, or placement. It was on the contents inside, the mysteries hidden behind its doors. Every note on the clipboard, every photo captured by the sunlight reflecting off metal and wood was building a story. The tension in the air was thick enough to feel, a palpable weight pressing down despite the warmth of the sun. The shed's secrets were no longer completely safe. As the inspectors finally stepped back, I took a moment to catch my breath. The backyard, bathed in bright daylight, had become a stage for revelation. The sunlight, once comforting, now illuminated every detail that could betray the shed's hidden contents. And though the inspectors were leaving for the moment, the air hummed with anticipation. I knew that the next steps, the next actions, would push the story forward into an inevitable confrontation between what was hidden and what was about to be revealed. The day stretched onward, bright and seemingly ordinary, yet every glance toward the shed reminded me of the inspection, the reflections, and the glimmers of what lay within. It was no longer just a piece of property under HOA scrutiny. It had become a vault of suspense, a focal point for a drama that would soon unfold in broad daylight. The tension built steadily, like the sun climbing higher in the sky, making the inevitable discovery feel all the more urgent. The morning arrived with a brilliance that made the entire neighborhood sparkle under the clear blue sky. Sunlight reflected off rooftops and freshly trimmed lawns, bouncing off windows in bursts that could almost blind. Yet despite the cheerful, ordinary appearance, the tension in my backyard had grown exponentially. The previous day's inspection had already revealed the HOA's intent. They weren't just concerned with the shed's placement or compliance. There was an unmistakable hunger in their scrutiny, a desire to see beyond the wood and nails, to discover whatever secrets it held. And today, they were back with reinforcements. I stepped onto the lawn, sunlight warming my face, though my stomach twisted with unease. From the corner of my eye, I could see the HOA's vehicles rolling slowly down the street. A second SUV, this one larger, and a small pickup truck carrying tools and equipment. It was obvious that they had come prepared for more than just a routine inspection. The bright sunlight made the vehicle's polished surfaces glint, emphasizing the authority they intended to project. My shed, standing quietly in its corner, seemed even smaller under the scrutiny of so many eyes, its wooden walls casting long shadows across the grass. As the reinforcements emerged, the scene began to take on an almost cinematic quality. Inspectors, clipboard in hand, moved deliberately toward the shed, accompanied by another figure carrying a measuring tape, a level, and even a small toolkit. Every motion was precise, rehearsed, and designed to intimidate. The sun glinted off metal clips and reflective surfaces, catching my attention and adding a sharpness to the visual scene. Each reflection seemed to hint at hidden intentions, as if the bright daylight itself conspired to reveal what was concealed. I circled the shed slowly, trying to appear casual while my mind raced. The previous inspection had revealed just enough for them to know that something unusual was concealed inside, but not enough to fully understand it. And now, with additional personnel, it was clear that the HOA intended to uncover the truth at any cost. I examined the wood closely, the paint peeling slightly at the corners, the moss creeping along the foundation, and the rusted hinges. Sunlight highlighted every imperfection, making each detail painfully obvious. The shed had always been a sanctuary, but under the bright, merciless light, it was suddenly exposed. The inspectors approached the shed in coordinated steps, scanning the exterior walls with an intensity that made my heart race. One crouched near the base, glancing at the ground for any signs of disturbance. Another stood back, measuring the dimensions of the structure, comparing them against HOA guidelines with meticulous care. Meanwhile, the third carried a small camera, capturing angles and reflections of the sun hitting the siding, as if the bright light itself would reveal something invisible. Every reflection, every shadow, seemed amplified in their eyes. I noticed subtle changes in the environment as well. The grass, once swaying gently in the breeze, now seemed to stiffen under the weight of anticipation. Birds, usually indifferent to my presence, circled overhead, their wings casting fleeting shadows across the yard. Even the white SUV parked across the street seemed charged with intention, its darkened windows hiding observers whose eyes followed every move. The yard, bright and sunlit, had transformed into a stage, with the shed as its central, unspoken character. The reinforcements began setting up around the shed, placing small markers on the ground, using measuring tapes to define its boundaries, and snapping photos from every angle. The sunlight illuminated their work, casting crisp shadows that made each movement seem more dramatic. As they moved, I realized how much of the shed story was now being documented. Every crack, every peeling paint strip, every hint of rust became part of a growing archive. I could almost hear the silent narrative being written by their pens, cameras, and reflective glances. Then came the moment that made my blood run cold. One of the inspectors, kneeling to examine the foundation, noticed a faint outline along the base of the shed, a subtle indentation that suggested something had been disturbed recently. The sunlight, streaming at just the right angle, highlighted a metal latch, hidden beneath the shadow of a wooden beam. Their eyes narrowed as they traced the line with a finger, lifting the latch slightly to reveal a small gap between the floor and the wall. It was as if the sun itself had betrayed me, casting light on what I had hoped would remain hidden. The other inspectors immediately converged, their expressions tense with anticipation. The sound of their movements, shuffling feet, snapping photos, clicking pens, echoed in the bright daylight, amplifying the suspense. Every inch of the shed seemed to hold a secret now, every reflection of sunlight across the panels revealing a hint of what lay beneath. My heart pounded as I realized that the reinforcements weren't just here to measure and assess. They were here to discover, to pry, and to expose what had always been private. Despite the growing anxiety, I maintained a calm posture, pretending to tend to a flower bed nearby, though every instinct told me to intervene, to secure the shed, to somehow keep what was inside from being revealed. The bright sunlight made the sweat on my brow glisten, highlighting the tension between the serene day and the storm that had taken over my backyard. The shed, once quiet and unassuming, had transformed into a focal point of suspense, a stage where secrets were poised to collide with revelation. The inspectors, now fully aware of the latch, worked carefully but with increasing urgency. One tested the mechanism, another shone a small flashlight into the gap to inspect the interior. I watched, sunlight reflecting off the surfaces of the shed and the metal tools, each glint amplifying the drama. The bright day, usually a symbol of clarity and safety, now felt intrusive, exposing every detail to eyes that were not supposed to see. The backyard, bathed in daylight, became a place of suspense and looming confrontation. As the inspection progressed, it became clear that the shed's secrets would not remain hidden much longer. Every movement, every reflection, every shadow cast by the sun seemed to guide the HOA toward discovery. The reinforcements, now working methodically and with an intensity that bordered on obsession, were piecing together the story of the shed, one angle, one reflection, and one glint of metal at a time. The suspense was unbearable, yet the bright sunlight ensured that every detail was revealed in stark clarity. By the late morning, it was evident that the inspection had reached a critical stage. The gap at the base of the shed had revealed just enough to hint that there was more inside, something worth exposing, something beyond ordinary compliance. The sunlight, streaming through the trees and reflecting off surfaces, highlighted the edges of objects inside, casting elongated shadows that teased at the hidden contents. My backyard, once a sanctuary of quiet and order, had become a theater of suspense, and the shed its central, secretive performer. The morning sunlight drenched the neighborhood in a clarity that left no corner in shadow. Every blade of grass sparkled, and the leaves on the trees shimmered as the wind made them sway gently. It was one of those days when everything seemed ordinary, peaceful, even idyllic, but beneath the golden light, tension clung to my backyard like a thick mist. The HOA had returned, larger this time, armed not just with clipboards and cameras, but with tools and determination. Their eyes, sharpened by prior inspections, were fixed firmly on the shed that had once stood quietly in the corner, now the center of an unfolding drama. I stood at a careful distance, trying to appear composed as the inspectors set their equipment around the shed. Measuring tools, ladders, and even a small hydraulic jack had been brought out, all glinting in the morning sunlight. Their movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, each action calculated to expose, pry, and uncover. The bright day made every shadow sharp, every reflection harsh. It was a paradox. The sunlight illuminated beauty, but now it also amplified the suspense, making the stakes feel unbearable. The inspectors began by circling the shed slowly, documenting every detail once again, but this time with heightened scrutiny. They crouched near the foundation, examining the gap I had hoped would go unnoticed. Sunlight struck the small metal latch hidden under a corner beam, and I saw their hands move with urgency. Cameras clicked and whirred as every angle, every reflection, every hint of the shed's hidden contents was captured. The bright daytime clarity left nothing unseen, nothing untouched. Even the faintest dust motes in air caught the sun, floating like tiny, glimmering witnesses to the moment. I could feel my heart pounding as they prepared to open the shed. The air seemed heavier now, each movement resonating against the wooden walls. I remembered all the items I'd stored inside over the years: tools, gardening equipment, old boxes filled with memories, and a few things I had never intended anyone to see. The thought that these walls, these doors, were about to reveal secrets made the sunlight feel intrusive, as if it were complicit in exposing the private history of my backyard. They tested the latch first, gently at first, then with increasing pressure. The metal creaked slightly under the force, glinting in the sunlight. The sound seemed to echo, creating a sense of suspense that made the bright morning feel surreal. Every inspector was focused, leaning in, eyes narrowed, capturing every flicker of movement and reflection. The shed, quiet and stoic, seemed almost sentient, resisting the prying hands, holding its secrets just a moment longer. The hydraulic jack was positioned carefully under one side of the door, sunlight reflecting off its polished surface. I could feel the anticipation building as the tool was slowly used to lift the door, the wood groaning in response. Every creak, every tiny snap of a hinge seemed louder than it should have been in the bright, calm morning. My backyard had transformed into a stage, the shed its protagonist, and the HOA its relentless audience, all bathed in the piercing clarity of sunlight. Finally, the door shifted enough to reveal a narrow glimpse inside. Shadows danced along the interior walls, distorted by the bright light spilling in from outside. The inspectors leaned closer, cameras capturing angles from every side. I could see the glimmer of objects hidden within: metal edges, wood, boxes, and shapes that had been obscured by darkness for years. The sunlight illuminated them partially, teasing at what lay deeper inside. I realized that this moment, in the middle of a sunny day, was the culmination of days of tension, suspicion, and silent preparation. As the door opened further, revealing more of the interior, the inspector's focus intensified. One crouched, pointing a flashlight into a deep corner where the sunlight couldn't reach, capturing details that otherwise might have remained hidden. Another carefully stepped inside, moving boxes aside to expose objects that had always been private. The bright morning made it almost impossible to hide anything. Reflections off metal handles, glints from glass jars, and the sheen of worn wooden surfaces all exposed secrets that had been safely tucked away. I watched every moment, sunlight catching the edges of my possessions, casting shadows that seemed exaggerated, stretching like fingers pointing out the truth. The shed, once a simple storage space, had become a vault of suspense, a repository of history, and now, in the relentless clarity of daylight, its contents were finally being revealed. Every inspection step was recorded, every angle captured, and every reflection exposed. The backyard, normally a sanctuary of calm, now buzzed with tension as secrets came to light. Among the items revealed were old boxes, carefully stacked, containing photographs, documents, and tools that had been part of my life for years. There were jars of seeds, small trinkets, and even a few family heirlooms that had been tucked away for safekeeping. The sunlight made everything look sharper, clearer, almost exaggerated, as if the bright day demanded the truth be seen. Every detail seemed amplified, every hidden item exposed in high definition to the HOA inspectors and their cameras. Then came the discovery that truly startled me. Beneath one stack of boxes, partially concealed by old wooden planks, was an object that I had almost forgotten, a small, locked chest, its metal edges gleaming under the sun. The inspectors immediately noticed it, their focus shifting entirely to this new revelation. Sunlight bounced off the metal, highlighting scratches and dents that had accumulated over decades. The chest, hidden for years, now demanded attention, its presence escalating the drama to an entirely new level. They moved cautiously, aware that this was no ordinary inspection. The chest seemed almost sacred, its existence a secret too long kept. The bright daylight reflected off every surface, revealing imperfections and clues, while casting deep shadows that only added to the suspense. I could feel the energy of the backyard shifting, the ordinary suburban calm shattered by the revelation of what had been hidden for so long. My shed, quiet and unassuming in its corner, had transformed into a stage where every secret was finally coming into the light. As the chest was carefully lifted, sunlight struck its edges, glinting dramatically and catching the attention of everyone present. The backyard seemed to hold its breath, the birds momentarily silent, the wind still, and even the neighboring houses reflected a glare of bright light that made the scene almost cinematic. Every step the inspectors took, every movement of the chest, was amplified by the brilliance of the day, making the suspense tangible, almost suffocating. It became clear that what had been hidden inside the shed was far more than just clutter, tools, or old boxes. The chest contained items of personal and historical significance, carefully preserved, and now exposed to the scrutiny of the HOA and their cameras. The bright sunlight illuminated the details of each object, from metal engravings to faded paper, creating a visual narrative that could not be ignored. The suspense reached its peak. The shed had fulfilled its role as a guardian of secrets, and the HOA had finally breached its defenses. The morning sun poured over my backyard with relentless clarity, illuminating every blade of grass, every leaf, and every imperfection in the shed. What had once been a calm, ordinary suburban yard now felt like the center of a storm, bright daylight exposing every tension, every shadow, and every secret. The shed's doors were fully open, revealing its hidden treasures to the HOA inspectors, whose expressions had shifted from routine scrutiny to something resembling astonishment. Their uniforms, crisp and official, seemed suddenly out of place in the face of the unexpected discovery. I watched them as they cautiously circled the shed, each step deliberate, their gazes fixed on the open chest at the center of the space. Sunlight streamed through the cracks of the roof and between the planks, casting sharp lines and deep shadows across the interior. Every detail, every object inside, was thrown into relief. Boxes of heirlooms, carefully preserved documents, and metal objects that glinted with age were laid bare in high definition by the sun itself. The brightness of the day seemed to make the contents impossible to ignore, almost demanding acknowledgement. The inspectors leaned in closer, snapping photos and adjusting their angles to capture every reflection, every surface. Their initial confidence, honed over countless routine inspections, had melted into something else entirely. They were now witnesses to a truth they hadn't anticipated. Even the tools they had brought, measuring tapes, levels, small hand tools, seemed unnecessary now, as the bright sunlight revealed everything without assistance. The backyard, under the clarity of day, had become a stage where secrets were exposed in full view. I stepped back slightly, letting the inspectors work, though the tension in my chest was nearly unbearable. The chest, its metal edges gleaming in the sun, seemed almost alive as the inspectors lifted the lid. Inside were carefully stored items, each one telling a story of my family, my hobbies, and my life in this home. Sunlight caught on the metal clasps of old tools, the edges of yellowed documents, and the faint sheen of varnished wood. Every detail seemed amplified, the bright day acting as a spotlight on what had always been private. The initial shock on the HOA's faces was palpable. They had expected a routine violation, a crooked shed, or perhaps some minor infraction. But instead, they were confronted with history, memory, and carefully preserved artifacts. The bright sun made every expression visible. Their eyes widened, their brows furrowed, and even the subtle shifts in posture were highlighted by the daylight. The dramatic contrast between the cheerful morning and the serious tension in the yard made the scene almost cinematic. As the inspectors sifted through the chest and the surrounding boxes, they uncovered letters, photos, and journals that documented decades of life in the house. Sunlight illuminated each page as they lifted it, revealing handwritten notes, sketches, and photographs. The bright day seemed to exaggerate the age of the papers, the faded ink, and the delicate folds, making the contents feel both fragile and significant. Each discovery deepened the sense of suspense. The shed had become a vessel for storytelling, and the HOA had just stumbled into the middle of it. Among the items were small, intricately carved objects, carefully preserved, their polished surfaces catching the sunlight in sharp reflections. The inspector's cameras captured every glint, every detail, documenting evidence that no one had anticipated. The bright day made it impossible to hide anything. Even the tiniest scratches and markings on objects were illuminated, magnifying their significance. It was as if the sunlight itself had sided with me, revealing the truth in all its clarity. The realization that this was no ordinary shed began to dawn on the HOA inspectors. Their movements became more careful, almost reverent, as if the bright daylight had not only exposed the contents, but demanded a measure of respect. Every reflection, every shadow, every glint of sunlight on metal would seem to underscore the importance of what lay before them. The backyard, usually a mundane suburban space, had transformed into a museum of personal history, with the shed as its exhibition hall. The inspectors' cameras clicked incessantly, recording angles from every side. Sunlight highlighted details that might have gone unnoticed in dimmer conditions. The subtle patina on old tools, the faded writing on letters, the slight curve of a well-loved book's spine. Each object told a story, and the bright clarity of the day made it impossible to ignore. The excitement and tension in the backyard were palpable. This was no longer a matter of compliance. It was a revelation. I moved slowly around the shed, watching as they uncovered more items, each discovery heightening the drama. A box of photographs revealed forgotten family memories, their glossy surfaces reflecting sunlight in bursts that caught everyone's attention. Journals lay open, their pages yellowed and delicate, capturing moments that spanned decades. Every glint, every reflection, every highlighted detail under the sun's bright gaze contributed to the suspense. It felt as though time itself had paused to watch the unfolding events. At one point, the inspectors leaned toward a small, carefully locked compartment within the chest. The metal lock reflected sunlight sharply, dazzling in the intensity of the day. I realized then that the drama had reached its peak. The shed's most secret contents were about to be revealed. Sunlight spilled into the compartment, casting long, sharp shadows and making every surface shimmer, exaggerating the tension. The backyard had become a theater of suspense, and the shed its central character, holding the power to shift the balance of the HOA's assumptions entirely. The implications of what had been found were undeniable. The shed, once seen as a minor structure, a possible violation, was now the keeper of decades of history, memory, and personal significance. The inspector's expressions, illuminated by the bright day, conveyed a mixture of surprise, respect, and confusion. What they had assumed to be ordinary was anything but. The backyard, under the intense clarity of daylight, had become a battlefield of perception versus reality. As they cataloged and photographed each discovery, the mood shifted subtly. The tension in the air was still present, but now it was tempered by the undeniable truth of what had been revealed. Sunlight, once threatening in its exposure, now highlighted the value and significance of the shed's contents. Every detail, from the smallest paperclip to the largest box, was recorded in vivid clarity, creating a visual and emotional record that no one could dispute. By midday, it was clear that the HOA's expectations had been shattered. What they had anticipated as a routine teardown had become an exploration of hidden treasures, memories, and a lifetime of care preserved within the shed. The bright daylight made every detail undeniable, illuminating both the shed and the truth it had contained. The backyard, once a calm suburban space, had become a stage of suspense, revelation, and quiet triumph. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, illuminating every corner of my backyard with a brightness that left nothing in shadow. What had once seemed like an ordinary suburban morning had become a stage for an extraordinary revelation. The shed, modest in size but monumental in significance, had finally revealed its secrets to the HOA, transforming their intentions from intimidation to astonishment. Every inch of my yard reflected the intensity of the moment. Shining metal, bright green grass, and the wooden walls of the shed bathed in relentless daylight that seemed to demand acknowledgement of the truth. I stepped back, surveying the scene. The HOA inspectors, who had arrived with clipboards, cameras, and tools to enforce their authority, now moved with a cautious deliberation. Their eyes, previously sharp with assumption and expectation, were now wide with the realization that the shed held something far more valuable than any code violation. Sunlight caught on every surface of the open shed, illuminating boxes, documents, heirlooms, and objects that had been safely tucked away for decades. Each ray of light seemed to amplify the significance of what lay inside, casting the backyard in an almost theatrical glow. The inspectors' hands hovered over items they had once intended to judge, now documenting, photographing, and carefully inspecting instead. Their cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every detail in sharp, sunlit clarity. The bright day left nothing hidden, yet the intensity of the sunlight made each discovery feel vivid, almost larger than life. Even the smallest trinkets shimmered, as if the shed itself were asserting its importance, demanding recognition and respect. The realization that the shed's contents were not only personal, but historically and emotionally significant changed the tone of the entire encounter. What had begun as a potential confrontation turned into a moment of reluctant acknowledgement. The HOA inspectors, usually quick to enforce their rules, now approached each object with an almost reverent caution. The sun, pouring down through the branches and reflecting off metal, glass, and polished wood, seemed to insist that the truth be recognized. The backyard, once a mundane space, had become a vivid tableau of suspense and revelation. The chest that had captured the inspector's attention remained open at the center of the shed. Its contents, carefully preserved heirlooms, letters, photographs, and journals, had drawn every gaze. Sunlight caught on the metal clasps and edges, glinting sharply and creating dynamic reflections that seemed to punctuate the story held within. Each artifact told a story of family, history, and personal care, and the inspector's movements now suggested a grudging respect rather than the determination to confiscate or tear down. The shed had become untouchable, its significance undeniable. As I watched, I realized how dramatically the atmosphere had shifted. The bright daytime clarity that had initially exposed my private possessions now emphasized their value. Boxes that had once seemed ordinary now appeared precious. Old photographs glowed with nostalgia. Journals, with sunlit pages slightly curling at the edges, whispered untold stories. Even the smallest objects, from rusted tools to forgotten trinkets, were highlighted in the sunlight, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss them as unimportant. The backyard had become a gallery of history and memory, and the shed its showcase. The inspectors slowly moved back, taking one last sweeping look at the shed's interior. Their clipboards, which had once carried notes about code violations, now held nothing but documentation of what had been revealed. Cameras lowered, pens paused, and the air seemed to shift with the acknowledgement that this was not an ordinary inspection. The bright sunlight, far from being a threat, had played a silent role as an arbiter of truth, revealing the depth and care embedded in every corner of the shed. In the hours that followed, the HOA finally conceded, their demeanor softened by the undeniable evidence before them. The backyard, once a place of tension and potential conflict, became a space of quiet resolution. The shed stood proudly in the corner, bathed in sunlight, a monument to patience, preparation, and perseverance. Every shadow, every glint, and every reflection highlighted the victory of truth over assumption. The shed's secrets had not only survived scrutiny, they had emerged triumphant, commanding recognition and respect. I took a slow walk around the shed, sunlight warming my face, feeling the weight of weeks of stress lift. The previously looming threat of demolition had evaporated under the bright clarity of day and the revelation of what had truly been hidden inside. The boxes, chests, and artifacts that had once been at risk were now safe, their significance undeniable. The backyard, filled with light and color, reflected the victory in every sun-dappled patch of grass and every gleam of wood and metal. Even the neighbors, who had quietly observed the unfolding events from their yards and windows, seemed to sense the shift. Sunlight caught on fences and rooftops, connecting each house with a shimmer that mirrored the clarity now achieved in my backyard. The drama had been intense, suspenseful, and day-bright, but now it was resolved. The shed, once the target of an HOA power play, had emerged as a symbol of privacy, history, and personal resilience. As the inspectors departed, the bright day seemed to celebrate the victory. Their vehicles reflected sunlight across the street, creating a dazzling visual punctuation mark to the event. The shed remained steadfast and proud, its hidden contents finally recognized and respected. The tension that had gripped my backyard for so long dissipated, replaced by a sense of triumph, clarity, and vindication. The bright sunlight illuminated every detail, leaving no shadow, no doubt, and no question about the shed's importance. I stood quietly, taking in the scene one last time, sunlight on my face, warmth on the grass underfoot. The HOA had tried to tear down my shed, to question my choices, and to assert authority over my private space. But their own scrutiny, magnified by the clarity of daylight and the undeniable significance of the shed's contents, had backfired. What was meant to intimidate had revealed truth, value, and history that demanded acknowledgement. In the end, the backyard returned to a semblance of peace. The shed remained standing, unscathed and respected, a bright testament to resilience and foresight. The sunlight, streaming generously over every corner, highlighted every triumph and every object of significance. What had begun as a suspenseful confrontation had concluded with vindication, clarity, and a new understanding of the shed's irreplaceable role in my life. The lesson was clear. Sometimes, even under the brightest scrutiny, the truth is revealed, and preparation, patience, and care are always rewarded. The HOA may have intended to expose or destroy, but instead, they had uncovered history, memory, and personal triumph, all in the full clarity of a bright, sunny day. And so, as the sunlight continued to flood the yard, the shed stood proud, its secrets safe, its significance acknowledged, and my backyard restored to its rightful order. Subscribe and like for more. The story ends, but the bright backyard, the proud shed, and the lessons of perseverance remain.